I still remember the exact moment my boss leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "I'm disappointed in you." Not angry, not confused, just disappointed, like the decision had already been made and I was only there to hear the sentence. That was the day Karen Whitmore, my department manager, successfully blamed me for her biggest mistake, a mistake serious enough to threaten my career, while she stood there proudly taking credit for the work I'd spent years grinding to perfect. This wasn't office gossip or ego bruising. This was my paycheck, my professional reputation, and 5 years of late nights and skipped weekends being quietly erased by someone who smiled while pushing me under the bus. I worked at a mid-sized property management firm, handling compliance for multiple HOAs around Redwillow Ridge, Ohio. Karen knew exactly how to play the system, how to hide behind paperwork, dodge accountability in meetings, and let silence do the damage. What she didn't know was that I documented everything, every email, every warning, every ignored red flag. And she definitely didn't realize how dangerous patience can be when someone is absolutely sure they're right. Because by the time this was over, I didn't just save my job. I ended her career using nothing but her own lies. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I started working for Summit Grove Property Services about 5 years earlier, fresh out of a smaller regional firm and eager to prove myself. My official title was Junior Compliance Coordinator, which is a fancy way of saying I was the person who made sure nothing blew up later. I reviewed HOA budgets line by line, checked vendor licenses, flagged contract issues, and made sure every report could survive an audit. It wasn't exciting work, but it mattered. And more importantly, I was good at it. The company handled multiple homeowners associations across the region surrounding Redwillow Ridge, Ohio. A lot of money moved through those HOAs, and small mistakes could turn into massive legal problems. I took that responsibility seriously. I stayed late. I triple-checked things. I built spreadsheets most people never even looked at, just in case someone someday needed answers fast. Karen Whitmore became my direct manager in my second year. From the outside, she looked like the perfect leader. Confident voice, sharp outfits. Always knew exactly what to say in meetings. Executives loved her because she spoke in polished buzzwords and never seemed rattled. But it didn't take long for me to notice something that made my stomach tighten. She didn't actually read anything. Karen would skim emails at best. She signed off on reports without opening attachments. If something looked thick or technical, she'd forward it to me with a short message like, "Looks fine, right?" or "Handle this for me." At first, I thought she trusted me. Later, I realized she simply didn't want to understand the details. In the beginning, that dynamic worked in my favor. She relied on me heavily, and my work kept her department running smoothly. When things went right, she'd say, "Great teamwork in meetings." Then, it slowly shifted to my department's performance. Eventually, she stopped mentioning the team at all. I noticed my name disappearing from reports I wrote. Presentations I built were suddenly being shown as if she'd created them. When executives complimented the accuracy of our compliance numbers, she smiled and said, "I'm very hands-on with this stuff." I didn't love it, but I told myself that was just how corporate life worked. As long as the work was solid and my performance reviews stayed strong, I could live with it. Then Summit Grove landed what everyone called the Redwillow expansion. Nearly 30 HOA communities were folded under a single management contract. It was huge. New boards, new vendors, new money, and a lot more regulatory attention. Karen was thrilled. She was put in charge of the entire rollout, and suddenly her name was everywhere. On day one, she called me into her office and told me she wanted me handling all financial compliance and vendor verification for the expansion. She said she needed to focus on relationships and optics. That should have been my first real warning, but I agreed. I knew the work. I trusted my process. The problem started with one vendor. They were brought in quickly to handle maintenance services across multiple communities. On paper, everything looked almost right. Almost. When I dug into their licensing records, I saw gaps. Expired certifications. Missing insurance documentation. Nothing dramatic, but enough to disqualify them until it was corrected. I flagged it immediately. I sent Karen a detailed email explaining the issues and recommending we delay approval until the vendor fixed their paperwork. I attached the compliance notes. I highlighted the risk. I followed up a few days later when I didn't hear back. She never responded. Then I noticed the vendor had already been approved in the system with her electronic signature. I emailed again, more urgently this time, explaining that approval had gone through before compliance clearance. I documented everything. I saved copies. I assumed it was a mistake she'd want to fix. She ignored it. 6 months later, the state audit arrived. Audits are always stressful, but this one was brutal. The Redwillow expansion was new, high profile, and exactly the kind of thing regulators love to examine. When they hit the vendor records, they found the licensing issues immediately. What should have been a small delay turned into a full compliance violation. Fines were issued. HOA boards demanded explanations. Executives started asking hard questions. And that's when Karen changed. Instead of taking responsibility, she started distancing herself from the decision. She claimed she'd relied on her team's recommendations. She hinted that compliance hadn't raised any concerns. She began subtly suggesting that someone below her level had dropped the ball. I didn't realize it at first, but looking back, that was the moment the ground cracked beneath my feet, and Karen decided I was the easiest thing to throw into the hole. The first sign that something was seriously wrong wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. I noticed one morning that an email chain I'd been active on for weeks had gone quiet. Not resolved, not closed, just quiet. When I checked, I realized I'd been removed from it entirely. At first, I told myself it was a mistake. Then, it happened again. Calendar invites stopped appearing. Meetings I normally attended suddenly conflicted with nothing on my schedule. I'd hear people referencing conversations I was never part of. Decisions were being made without me, about work that was supposedly still my responsibility. The pit in my stomach started to grow. A few days later, I found out why. There was a leadership meeting, one I wasn't invited to, where Karen stood at the front of the room and walked executives through a set of compliance reports. Reports I had written, reports I recognized, down to the formatting quirks and phrasing. My name wasn't anywhere on them. She spoke confidently about my review process and my oversight, explaining how her department had handled the vendor situation. She didn't mention the warnings I sent. She didn't mention the emails she ignored. She presented the failure as a simple mistake that had already been corrected under her leadership. I didn't hear about that meeting directly. I heard about it secondhand, from someone who assumed I'd been there. That was when the dread really set in. A week later, HR emailed me asking me to come by for a quick conversation. It wasn't quick. They closed the door, sat me down, and slid a printed compliance failure report across the table. My name was highlighted. They asked me, calmly and professionally, why I had approved an unlicensed vendor for the Redwillow expansion. I remember feeling physically sick. My ears rang. My hands went cold. I took a breath and explained exactly what happened. I told them I hadn't approved anything. I told them I'd flagged the issue early. I told them I had emailed Karen multiple times. I asked them to look at the approval record. They did. Karen's name was there, her electronic signature, her timestamp. But HR already had something else. Karen had submitted an internal memo before the audit review even began. In it, she claimed that she had relied on my recommendation and that I had verbally assured her the vendor was compliant. According to her, she'd trusted my judgment. That was the lie. There was no email. No message. No note. Just her word. And in corporate environments, a manager's word carries weight, especially when the employee they're blaming isn't in the room when the story is first told. HR didn't accuse me outright, but their tone shifted. They asked why my documentation didn't include a formal stop request. They asked why I hadn't escalated further. They asked why, if the risk was so clear, the approval had still gone through. Every question felt like a crack forming under my feet. After that meeting, things spiraled fast. My next performance review was suddenly under reconsideration. Projects I'd led successfully were now being described as team efforts under Karen's direction. I overheard whispers in the hallway, comments about me being overwhelmed or missing details. People stopped looping me in proactively. Trust, once damaged, spreads quietly. I decided to confront Karen directly. I went to her office, closed the door, and asked her why she told HR I'd recommended approving that vendor. I kept my voice steady. I gave her an opening to correct it, to say it was a misunderstanding. She didn't even flinch. She smiled, a small, tight smile, and leaned back in her chair. "This is what leadership looks like," she said. "Sometimes things go wrong, and someone has to be accountable. You should have been more careful." That was the moment everything clicked. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't office politics gone wrong. This wasn't an accident born from pressure or stress. She had made a decision. She had seen the audit coming, felt the heat rising, and chosen the person below her who knew the most and spoke the least. She had isolated me from conversations, removed me from visibility, taken my work, and rewritten the story before I even knew a story was being told. I walked out of her office with my heart pounding, not from fear anymore, but from clarity. I understood exactly what was happening. And I understood that if I reacted emotionally, if I rushed, if I panicked, I would lose. So I did the opposite. I got quiet. I let her think the setup had worked. And I started preparing to prove, step by step, that the story she built was about to collapse under its own weight. Most people would have panicked at that point. I know I should have. My job was on the line, my reputation was already bleeding out quietly, and the person responsible had power over every conversation I wasn't allowed to hear. But I didn't panic. Because one thing compliance work drills into you early is this: if something matters, you document it. If it might matter later, you document it twice. And if someone seems a little too confident that nothing will ever be questioned, you document everything. I went home that night and opened my personal backup drive. Inside were folders I'd built over years without really thinking about it. Every flagged issue I'd ever raised, every unanswered email, every calendar invite that showed I'd been excluded, every document version with metadata intact, timestamps, change logs, approval trails. It was all there, quietly waiting. Karen thought she'd erased me by controlling the narrative. She hadn't erased the evidence. What I didn't expect was help. A few days after the HR meeting, Marcus Hill from Internal Audit stopped by my desk. Marcus was senior level, careful with his words, and known for being painfully thorough. He didn't gossip. He didn't speculate. If Marcus spoke, it was because he'd already checked something twice. He asked if we could talk privately. In a small conference room, he told me he'd been reviewing compliance summaries related to the Redwillow expansion, and something felt off. The tone didn't match the underlying data. Warnings seemed softened. Responsibility appeared, redistributed. Then he said something that made my pulse spike. He told me Karen had asked him to adjust language in a draft audit summary to make it sound like oversight and approvals had come directly from her office based on team recommendations. Not explicitly false, just vague enough to redirect accountability. Marcus hadn't agreed to do it. Instead, he started comparing versions. That was the first real crack in Karen's armor. I didn't tell Marcus everything right away. I didn't need to. He already knew enough to be curious, and curiosity in an auditor is dangerous. I simply told him I had documentation that might help if he ever needed clarity. From that moment on, I changed my behavior completely. I stopped defending myself in meetings. I stopped pushing back. I stopped explaining. When Karen assigned me tasks related to fixing the audit fallout, I accepted them without comment. She took that as submission. She started treating me like damage control, the person who would quietly clean up messes while she presented the recovery as her own leadership success. She'd assign me corrective reports, vendor reconciliations, and follow-up documentation, then summarize the outcomes to executives as evidence of how she'd stabilized the situation. And I let her. Because every task she handed me created more evidence. Every report I produced showed my competence. Every time she forwarded my work upward without attribution, it created another traceable connection. She was building my case for me, one confident email at a time. Behind the scenes, I organized everything. I built a timeline that started months before the audit. I aligned my warning emails with approval timestamps. I matched calendar exclusions with decisions made in my absence. I saved screenshots. I preserved metadata. I labeled everything clearly, not emotionally. This wasn't about revenge yet. It was about precision. Karen grew bolder as weeks passed. She spoke openly about learning experiences and team accountability. She subtly suggested that her department had identified weaknesses and corrected them under her leadership. The irony was almost unbearable. What she didn't realize was that by rewriting history so aggressively, she was creating inconsistencies that couldn't coexist. Her story required me to have influence I clearly didn't have and responsibility without access. The more she talked, the less her version made sense. Marcus eventually came back to me with a quiet update. Internal audit was considering a deeper, independent review. Not because of me, because the documentation didn't align. That was when I knew the turning point had arrived. I didn't need to accuse Karen. I didn't need to expose her publicly. All I had to do was stay calm, stay quiet, and let the truth line itself up in a way that no amount of confidence or positioning could override. She thought I was fading out of the picture. In reality, I was letting her step further and further into a story she wouldn't be able to explain her way out of. Over the next 3 weeks, I treated my situation like a case that might someday be argued in front of people who didn't care about feelings, only facts. Every evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table and assembled a timeline so clean and precise it could have passed for a legal brief. I started at the beginning. The day the Redwillow expansion was announced. The first email assigning me compliance responsibility. The first time I flagged the vendor's missing credentials. I pulled the original messages, complete with timestamps and attachments, and lined them up next to the approval record that showed Karen's signature going through anyway. Then I layered in context. Meeting notes that proved I'd been excluded from key discussions after the audit risk became clear, calendar logs showing invites I'd been removed from, document version histories that clearly identified me as the original author of reports Karen later presented as her own. Each piece on its own might have been explainable. Together, they told a story that was impossible to ignore. I even found internal chat logs I'd forgotten about. Casual messages Karen had sent during the chaos, joking about handling the audit fallout and reassuring colleagues that it's under control now. At the time, they sounded like confidence. In the right context, they sounded like someone who knew exactly when things had gone wrong. I didn't rush. I labeled everything carefully. I avoided commentary. No accusations, no emotional language, just facts, dates, and sequences. While I was doing that, Marcus was working quietly on his end. He submitted a request for an independent audit review, something completely legitimate, but rarely used unless inconsistencies were serious. The request didn't accuse anyone. It simply asked for a deeper look at how approvals, warnings, and accountability had flowed during the expansion. That request set off alarms. Karen didn't know exactly what Marcus was doing, but she could feel the shift. Meetings became tense. Her tone sharpened. She started checking in on me more frequently, asking pointed questions about what I was working on and who I was talking to. Then she made a mistake. A new, smaller compliance issue surfaced with a different vendor. Nothing major, but enough to be documented. Karen tried to move fast and quietly assigned it to me, then referenced it in an email to leadership as something that had slipped through before being caught. She was setting the stage to blame me again if it grew. This time, I didn't push back. I didn't send long explanations. I followed instructions, documented everything, and waited. Because that was the confirmation I needed. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't stress. This was a pattern. She had learned that shifting blame worked, and she was doing it again. Once my timeline was complete, I took the next step. I requested a formal review meeting with HR, legal, and compliance leadership. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I didn't accuse Karen of anything. I simply said I wanted to clarify my role and responsibilities related to the Redwillow expansion and the audit findings. That wording mattered. It made the meeting about accuracy, not conflict. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Karen accepted the invite immediately. When she walked into that conference room, she looked relaxed, confident, almost amused. She greeted people warmly, joked lightly, and sat down like someone who believed the situation was already handled. She even thanked me for all the hard work I'd done during the audit cleanup. I watched her closely. She was too calm, too comfortable. She thought the narrative was locked in. She believed she'd already won, that whatever damage had been done to me couldn't be undone. From her perspective, this meeting was just a formality, a chance to reinforce the story she'd already told. What she didn't know was that the version of events she'd built only worked as long as no one laid everything out in order. And that was exactly what I was about to do. The meeting was scheduled for 90 minutes. It lasted just over 3 hours. We sat in a long conference room with HR, legal, compliance leadership, and Karen at the far end of the table, perfectly composed. A legal pad in front of her. A pen neatly aligned. She looked like someone ready to manage optics, not defend facts. Karen was invited to speak first. She didn't hesitate. She outlined what she called process breakdowns during the Redwillow expansion. She spoke smoothly, confidently, using the same polished language executives loved. She referenced missed steps, communication gaps, and recommendations that weren't properly escalated. She never raised her voice. She never used my name directly, but it was obvious who she was pointing at. She referenced documents she assumed no one would actually examine. When she finished, she leaned back slightly, satisfied. That's when the room turned to me. I didn't argue her version. I didn't react emotionally. I didn't even contradict her directly. I said I'd prepared a timeline to help clarify roles and decision points. Then I opened my folder. I started at the beginning. The initial assignment email that placed compliance responsibilities on me and final approval authority on her. I showed the first vendor review, complete with my flagged notes and the date I sent them. I showed the follow-up email when I didn't receive a response. Then I showed the approval record, Karen's electronic signature, her timestamp, her authorization. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving everyone time to read. Email by email, approval by approval, timestamp by timestamp. When legal asked Karen why she signed off on a vendor marked as non-compliant, she paused, not for a second, for several. She said she'd relied on internal recommendations. Legal asked where those recommendations were documented. She didn't answer right away. Then compliance leadership asked why I'd been excluded from meetings where corrective actions were discussed if I was supposedly responsible for the decision. They pulled up calendar records I'd already provided. Canceled invites, removed access, meetings held without me. Karen shifted in her chair. She said those meetings were high level. That answer didn't land well. That's when Marcus spoke. He calmly presented the independent audit findings, not opinions, not accusations, just inconsistencies, language adjustments requested, documentation that didn't align with approval authority, a pattern of accountability being redirected after the fact. The room went completely quiet. Karen tried to jump in. She started to explain, to contextualize, to smooth it over. HR held up a hand and told her to wait. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen didn't control the room. Questions started coming faster, from legal, from compliance, from HR. Not about feelings, but about process. About why warnings weren't escalated. About why authorship had been misrepresented. About why internal memos contradicted recorded approvals. Karen's answers became shorter, less confident. She repeated phrases, she deflected, she blamed miscommunication, and the more she talked, the worse it sounded. I didn't say much after that. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Every document I presented lined up cleanly. Every explanation I offered was supported. There were no gaps. By the end of the meeting, no one was looking at me like a problem anymore. They were all looking at Karen. The meeting didn't end with raised voices or dramatic accusations. It ended with HR thanking everyone for their time and saying they needed to review the information internally. Karen stood up quickly. She avoided eye contact. She didn't say a word to me. I packed up my folder slowly, calmly, with a strange sense of relief settling in. For the first time since this started, the story wasn't being told behind closed doors without me. It was finally being examined in the open. And it wasn't my version that was falling apart. Karen was placed on administrative leave the next morning. There was no announcement, no dramatic email blast. Just a quiet change in the internal directory and an auto reply on her inbox saying she was out of office until further notice. In a company like ours, that phrase carried weight. Everyone noticed it. No one asked questions out loud. For 2 weeks, everything went silent. HR didn't contact me. Legal didn't follow up. Meetings related to the Redwillow expansion were postponed or handled by interim leadership. It felt strange, like standing in the calm eye of a storm after months of constant pressure. I kept doing my job, documenting everything as usual, answering questions when asked, and staying out of speculation. Then the findings came back. The internal review confirmed exactly what the evidence had shown. Karen had misrepresented authorship by presenting team-generated compliance work as her own oversight. She had knowingly shifted blame downward after the audit risk became clear. She had requested language changes in audit documentation that altered how responsibility appeared to flow. And most damning of all, she had violated internal ethics policy by submitting a memo she knew was not supported by documentation. There was no way to spin it. Her termination wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She was called into a private meeting with HR and legal. Her access was revoked the same day, and by the following week her name was removed from every leadership directory and project listing. That was it. The HOA boards she had proudly presented to were notified that leadership had changed due to internal compliance findings. No details were shared, but people in those circles read between the lines. The executives who once praised her hands-on leadership stopped mentioning her entirely. Her biggest asset, perception, evaporated overnight. Within days, her professional network distanced itself. Meetings she would have been invited to moved on without her. Conversations shifted. Silence followed. Her reputation collapsed faster than it had been built. And me? HR scheduled a follow-up meeting to formally close the issue. They issued a written statement clearing my record. My performance review was corrected. Notes referencing the vendor issue were removed from my file. Leadership acknowledged on record that I had identified the compliance risk early and acted appropriately. It wasn't just private reassurance, it was formal, documented, shared with the same people who had once questioned me. The relief hit slowly, then all at once. For months, I'd carried the weight of someone else's choices, wondering if quiet truth was enough in a system that rewarded confidence over accuracy. Now I knew the answer. Truth doesn't always win quickly, but when it wins, it does so completely. I walked out of that meeting lighter than I'd felt in a long time, knowing that while Karen had built her authority on borrowed work and borrowed credit, I'd built mine on something that finally couldn't be taken away. And for the first time since this began, my future felt like it belonged to me again. The week after everything became official, I was called into another meeting. This one felt very different. HR and compliance leadership sat across from me with relaxed expressions instead of guarded ones. The tension that had hung over every conversation for months was gone. They thanked me for my professionalism throughout the review and acknowledged, directly, that the company's compliance systems had relied far too heavily on trust instead of verification. Then they made an offer. They asked if I would be willing to step into Karen's former role. On paper, it was a promotion most people would have jumped at. Bigger title, more visibility, more influence. But as they explained the expectations, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. That position came with constant meetings, executive optics, and the same political balancing act that had allowed Karen to operate the way she did. I surprised them by saying no. Instead, I told them what I actually wanted. I asked for a senior compliance position with direct reporting authority to legal and audit, a role that focused on oversight, documentation, and process integrity rather than presentation. Less politics, more protection. Clear authority, clear boundaries. They agreed. The change was immediate. My responsibilities expanded, but so did my safeguards. Decisions were documented. Approvals required multiple confirmations. Compliance warnings could no longer be ignored or buried under vague language. What had once depended on personalities now depended on process. Marcus was promoted shortly after. His insistence on accuracy and refusal to adjust language without evidence had been noted. He became a key part of the new review structure, and together we helped design updated audit procedures that made it nearly impossible for accountability to be quietly shifted after the fact. The ripple effects reached beyond the company. The Redwillow Ridge HOA community stabilized within months. Vendors were re-reviewed properly. Boards received clearer reporting. Questions were answered directly instead of being smoothed over. Trust, once damaged, slowly rebuilt, not because someone spoke confidently, but because the numbers finally made sense. People noticed. Compliance stopped being seen as a nuisance and started being treated like a foundation. Meetings changed. Fewer assumptions. More verification. Less room for ego. As for Karen, she vanished. At first, her name still floated around in hushed conversations, speculation about where she'd land next, who might take her in. But 6 months passed, then more, and nothing surfaced. No new leadership announcements, no industry panels, no consulting gigs. In a field as small as property management compliance, silence is loud. Her career hadn't ended with a public scandal or dramatic fallout. It ended with something far more final. Lost credibility. And once that's gone, there's nowhere left to stand. Sometimes I think about how close I came to losing everything simply because someone higher up decided the truth was inconvenient. But I also think about how much stronger the system became because it was forced to confront that reality. I didn't win by being louder or more aggressive. I won by being precise, patient, and impossible to ignore. And in the end, that made all the difference. Looking back now, the hardest part of all of this wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't watching my work get taken, my reputation questioned, or my future quietly put at risk by someone who smiled while doing it. The hardest part was the waiting. Waiting while someone else told my story for me. Waiting while a lie settled in and started to feel real to the people around it. waiting while I resisted the urge to defend myself loudly, knowing that panic would only help the person who caused the damage. I didn't destroy Karen's career out of anger or revenge. I didn't have to. All I did was refuse to let fear rush me into a mistake. I let the truth sit exactly where it belonged and gave it time to surface on its own. If there's one lesson I took from this, it's simple. Document everything. Keep records even when things feel routine. Stay calm when someone else is trying to control the narrative. And never underestimate how dangerous patience can be when it's paired with proof. Some people build their careers by stepping on others, assuming no one will ever notice the cracks they leave behind. But gravity always works eventually. No matter how confident someone sounds, no matter how polished their story is, reality has a way of catching up when it's written down, time-stamped, and impossible to erase. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?